So last time we were talking about how humans affect different types of biomes. Grasslands, I think we talked about grasslands, but maybe we didn't, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about them anyway. So grasslands, humans affect grasslands by burning the grasslands, just a control burn for the whole thing to convert it to farmland. Grasslands actually make really good farmland, and part of that is because of the adaptations the grasses have. They have most of their biomass in the soil, and so when they die, they take that carbon and a lot of those nutrients, they cycle into the soil, they enrich the soil, and not only just bringing carbon but bringing those phosphorus, the a little bit of sulfur and nitrogen, all those compounds back into the soil, as well as potassium. And since they have a lot of that biomass that's decaying and rotting after they burn the whole thing off, in the actual soil, they have a lot of those nutrients that are just kind of stored there for very long periods of time. Overgrazing. Grazing is an activity where we take, like, let's say we take our cattle, and instead of having it in a lot of pastures like we see where we live, they take them out into the natural environment and have them graze on these lands. We would also call that the commons. Basically, the commons are an area where everyone's allowed to use it. And so we call it the commons because it's just common to everyone. And then again, off-road vehicles like the deserts. Not as big of an issue here in grasslands as is the desert because the plants do regenerate a lot faster, but still an issue. All right, forests. We have a lot of issues with forests. We cut them down for lumber. We cut them down to make farmlands, especially tree plantations. So palm oils. Palm oil is in pretty much most of your processed food, in your mac and cheese, in Doritos. Doritos, I think, are making a stand and stopping using palm oils, just because people will destroy the forests, cut that down, and then turn it into a palm oil plantation. But also, we cut them down for farming. Well, farming, tree plantation, pretty much the same thing. And urban development. When we say urban development, you guys probably know the word urban from your, I forgot what the name is, your geography class. But urban is another word for city development. And so when the city grows, it just gets larger and larger, and then we run into more and more of the forest and have to cut more of the forest down for more construction. All right, so this video you're going to see is going to talk a lot about palm oil and how it's affecting the environment and why it's leading to a lot of these forests, but forest destruction. But not only are we losing the forest, when they remove the forest, they're doing what we call slash and burn techniques, where basically they cut down huge sections, not cut down huge sections of the forest, they light huge sections of the forest on fire, and it releases tons and tons of stored CO2 from the biomass directly into the atmosphere, as well as any pollution, any toxins that were stored into the trees. We also get carbon or soot into the air that wasn't burned very effectively. CO, so carbon monoxide, also gets released in the air. So we get a lot of this released chemicals directly in the air when we have a burn off these forests. But there's more of an effect than just losing trees.
There's a good chance you're not familiar with it, even though you'll find it in many of the products you use every day. It's in everything, from makeup and toothpaste to donuts, chocolate bars, and in some countries, biodiesel fuel. It goes by many names, but it's most commonly known as palm oil. Global consumption of palm oil has quintupled since 1990. Oil derived from the palm fruit is easy to extract, has a higher yield than other types of vegetable oils, and can be used in dozens of products. But the proliferation of palm oil also poses a massive environmental threat. Each year, palm oil plantations destroy millions of acres of forested land, create billions of tons of carbon pollution, and kill endangered wildlife. All of this makes the palm oil industry one of the worst environmental offenders on the planet. In 2015, over 62,000 square miles around the world, much of it former forests, were committed to palm oil plantations. That's an area 4 times the size of Switzerland. Palm oil is one of the top 3 drivers of deforestation in Indonesia, a country that supplies more than half of global demand. Each year in Indonesia, fires are set to clear forested lands to make way for palm oil production. Just last year, over 10,000 square miles were torched, creating fires so big they could be seen from outer space. All of this unleashes massive amounts of carbon into the air. Fires in 2015 added more than 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The burning of forests to clear land for plantations threatens the 10,000 square mile Luso ecosystem in Sumatra, the largest intact swath of rainforest in Southeast Asia. It's home to hundreds of unique species and is the only place left in the world where orangutans, rhinos, tigers, bears, and elephants live side by side. But their home is disappearing around them. The Sumatran tiger and the Sumatran rhino are threatened with extinction. Only a few hundred of each species exist in the wild, and their habitats are often in the path of land clearing. In Borneo, there has been a 50% decrease in orangutan populations in the past 65 years. This is a direct result of the forest fires and conversion of woodlands for palm oil cultivation. Alongside logging and mining, land clearing for agriculture is currently one of the leading causes of deforestation. If consumers don't demand more sustainable practices soon, the products we buy can and will contribute to the loss of the world's rainforests. You can help by purchasing products that do not contain palm oil, or if they do, were made sustainably. Go to takepart.com/palm oil for more information.
All right, so next major biome category are mountains. So humans affect mountains through something called terrace farming. We don't have too much of that here in Utah, so some of you have probably never seen it. See this a lot in Asia. So what they do is they basically level off small sections of the mountain. Like you see this slope here. Instead of being a slope, it's basically kind of been turned into what you would imagine steps would look like on the side of a mountain. Well, what they've done is they're farming here. Sorry, let me full screen this. They're farming here where they've got all these terraces, and what's convenient is they'll start the water at the top and it will move through these different kind of pools and areas and water the entire crop area, which is kind of ingenious if you think about it. But it helps maximize that land area when you've got a lot of hilly terrain. Here is another photo of that. I think these are actually rice paddies. So we've got the water flowing from one section to the other, slowly going down the mountainside. All right, so humans affect mountain terrains through terrace farming, which is what that is right there. Logging, that's a no-brainer because most of the forests are actually in the mountains. Mining, so mining for heavy metals, mining for diamonds, and mining for anything, any kind of ores that we might need. Air pollution. So you think, how can air pollution affect mountains? But what we have here is more like industries, pollution coming from smokestacks, pollution coming from transportation, moving in the air, and then we've got a lot of this stuff raining down. So you can have pollution just raining down, or a lot of times these nitrogen and sulfur compounds that come from burning of fossil fuels can mix with rainwater, and then when it rains down, and it rains down as acid rain. And the biggest problems with acid rain aren't, a lot of people think acid rain hits a plant and then it just dissolves the plant and the plant dies. But mainly what we see with acid rain is it's going to affect the main photosynthetic organ of the trees or any kind of plant. So that would be the leaves. The leaves are the organs that are doing that photosynthetic reaction for the most part on most plants. So what happens is it kind of burns the leaves and reduces their ability to do photosynthesis. But the biggest problem with acid rain is when the acid rain hits the soils. The acid in the acid rain will react with the chemicals that are actually in the soils. And when it does that, it will leach out things like aluminum faster than it would normally get leached out of the soil. And so we've got this toxin for plants leaching out of the soil faster than it would, and then it's getting into the plants and harming the plants that way. Another thing is it leaches out nitrogen, potassium, and NPK, potassium, phosphorus, and it takes those nutrients and it washes them out a lot faster, and so the soils will actually leach the nutrients out of it a lot faster, and it will go into the waterways. And then off-road vehicles again. All right, now one thing about the United States, which is really good for once, right? But one thing about the United States is we used our forests to the brink of almost getting rid of our forests during that time right before we started switching to fossil fuels to run our industrial processes. We were using a lot of wood for that. We have been working really hard to restore our forests to kind of the way they were. Once we've actually restored the forest more than they were. But what we see worldwide is we've actually lost 50% of our forests worldwide. Now, a lot of that is to farming. Here is the Amazon rainforest, very famous forest, so pretty much all of you know about it. If we go out here, outside of Brazil, Brazil is working really hard at trying to maintain the forest, but a lot of the other countries aren't doing so well. So right here, you can see this urban expansion as I zoom into the forest. Right here where the forest has been cut down in these patches. If I can zoom in far enough. Here, this right here, this section here, these are primarily turned into farm fields. And our forests, this is Google Earth here, and it kind of shows, see right here, the East Coast isn't as thick as it used to be, but it has recovered quite a bit. And what's interesting is we actually have quite a bit more forest here in the western United States. I know it looks really dry because, well, it's pretty desertous over here. But we've actually grown and produced more forests in this region than we originally had in the United States. This is really cool. But due to logging, if I zoom in here, it kind of looks deceivingly thick. If I zoom in, you can almost, and it doesn't matter where I zoom in on the map, you can start to see these checkers, these squares start to show up. And by the way, these are volcanoes right here, so they're just kind of cool. I'm just mentioning that real quick. But right here, we've got a lot of sections. These patches are places where we have cut down the forest for lumber. So logging companies will come in and they'll clear cut, which means they cut everything down indiscriminately. Old trees, new trees, doesn't matter. Areas look like a newly cut area here. See where everything's been cut, and they leave it for a good 30 years for the forest to try to start to recover. And then here you can see where this area may have been cut for a very long time ago, and where you can see the trees, if I can zoom a bit here, that are starting to grow back. So you've got this massive section of the forest where a lot of the trees are starting to go back. Now, some logging companies, they actually send drones out and they drop like these seed bombs where there's just like a bunch of seeds inside of them, and so it helps these trees to grow back faster because you can't just cut down all the trees and then just magically trees appear out of nowhere. Let's go ahead and zoom out. But you can see this patchwork. So we have a lot of habitat fragmentation from this. Now, the best places that are untouched are usually places that are just too hilly for people to be able to get to. But I mean, look around, if I go anywhere on the map, we've got this patchwork. We were utilizing the forest for lumber. Right, so now some good news about our forests. I was talking about earlier how they have regrown a little bit. So this is a map of what our forest looked like at 1620. So pretty much when colonists started to come over here to the U.S. and colonize the West Coast. Now the native peoples lived here before, but you can see a quick change at 1920 what happened to our forest. So let's go back and look at that horrific picture right there. So here we got 1620, and then you can see nearly all the forests are gone. Now this was because of that time period, right about the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution started coming around. We started manufacturing a lot of more things, and we needed a lot more energy to be able to do those manufacturing processes. And for the most part, we were using trees before we figured out that fossil fuels would be very, very useful for this. So right here, we have a snapshot of what the forest looked like in 1920, and then here's 2000. So good thing here is, yeah, we did lose a lot of our forest, probably lost a lot of biodiversity there as well. But through secondary ecological succession, we've grown back a tremendous amount of the forest. So here we have 1620, 1920, and then 2000. Now, if you notice, the East Coast has definitely not gotten fully restored. However, if you look at the West, we actually have a lot of places here in the West where we have more forested area than we used to. Alright, we're going to ignore that act because we actually need to know a lot of the less of the laws that we had to know last time. Alright, so tropical rainforest. 40% of all the tropical rainforests in the world are in the Amazon basin. So that part of, let me zoom into this map real quick, really this part of South America. When we remove the forest, we're also removing that nutrient cycling that we talked about. So specifically, rainforests don't make for very good farmland because that nutrient cycling process is no longer there. But it also stops the tree's ability to remove carbon dioxide from the air, stopping that carbon sink. And when the trees die, it's actually adding carbon to the air, especially if we do a control burn where we are slashing and burning the forest very rapidly. We're very quickly adding large amounts of carbon dioxide into the air from that process. It also removing trees also dries the land out, so the ground isn't holding as much moisture as it would before, which leads to more deforestation because drier conditions supports fewer trees, and it also can increase wildfires as well. So more than 50% of the world's oxygen actually does not come from trees. A lot of people think most of the oxygen actually comes from trees, but about 54-ish% of all the world's oxygen actually comes from tiny little organisms called phytoplankton that live out in the oceans. But a third of the world's oxygen that's replenished in the atmosphere all the time comes from our forests, with 20% solely coming from the Amazon rainforest alone. We're going to skip that, and we're going to go on to the next subject of forest natural capital. Now remember, natural capital is the natural environment that a country is going to be benefiting from, either through being able to make a profit from, or having some kind of ecosystem services that just kind of help do nutrient cycling or pollination. Some of those services that help, is maybe not necessarily we're profiting off of, but we're definitely profiting off of crops that get fertilized by bees when they come through the orchards and do that natural ecosystem service. So I've been told a lot that kids really struggle between knowing the difference between ecosystem services and economic services. Questions on FRQs will tend to use this word economic services, and kids usually say things like pollination and nutrient cycling, and those are not economic services. I think the biggest problem is probably people are reading too fast, and so they see ecosystem services and they automatically think it is, or economic services and automatically think it's something else. But ecosystem services, forests provide many of those. Again, nearly a third of the world's oxygen replenishing supply is provided by forests. Forests help to clean the air and the water. Forests will take in dirty, polluted air, and it will help give off clean oxygen and clean water vapor. Trees pull in tons of water from their roots up into the tree, and it's not necessarily clean, but the tree will use that water and then it will send it out of its leaves through that process of transpiration. pollution tends to either stay in the body of the tree or it gets broken down by the tree into less harmful forms of a pollutant. It also provides habitats for lots of organisms. Trees can hold hundreds of gallons of water, making them a local reservoir for water. And because they hold a lot of water, it helps alter local climate a few ways. One, trees help shade the ground surface, so they reduce evaporation, allowing more plants to be able to survive in that location. And that shade also reduces sunlight on the forest floor, which cools the area as well. But trees also give off gases other than oxygen, but some things called aerosols. And aerosols from trees tend to be able to reflect sunlight back into the sky, which is not like, oh, the tree's trying to reduce the sunlight on itself. It's just kind of a thing that happens when the trees release some of these gases. So we haven't talked about this yet, but sunlight activity is what actually warms the earth. Heat from the sun does not warm the earth. So the sunlight comes in, hits matter, interacts with matter, and it vibrates the matter, and that matter changes the light energy into heat energy. We'll talk more in detail about that later. But these aerosols do not absorb the light energy, but instead they act as a mirror, tiny little mirrors in the atmosphere, where the light will come in and it will bounce right back out into space. So they actually can reduce the amount of solar radiation falling on the area. And then here we have this nutrient cycling process, because trees are producing, especially in deciduous forests, where trees are producing those leaves, they're dropping their leaves every fall, and they're making the soils more nutrient rich every time that these leaves are decomposed by decomposers and cycled back into the earth system. So economic services are going to be things we're directly profiting from. So forests provide fuel for wood burning stoves. We don't have too many wood burning stoves here in the United States, but a lot of people in poorer countries use that as their main fuel source. We use forests for lumber. We use forests for paper goods, for toilet paper, regular paper, paper towels, paper plates, all that kind of stuff. Forests provide areas where we do mining in mountains, livestock grazing, recreation due to people going camping, people going hiking, people going swimming and using lakes that tend to be in mountain areas as well. And then we also have job creation by forestry, jobs created by lumber companies, jobs created through tour guides and stuff like that. All right, logging is the harvesting of trees. So there's a lot of logging techniques and processes that we do, and some are more environmentally friendly than others. So we've already talked about deforestation before, but it's deforesting, so it's removing forests. But most of a tremendous amount of deforestation, over half the world's forests have been destroyed for agriculture, human settlements, or other needs or uses, urban expansion. Most of that destruction has occurred in just the last 60 years to our forests. So we're using more resources more and more and more, and mainly that reason is because we have more and more and more people. We are expanding the human population at exponential growth, and with that becomes a need for more and more resources, especially for more lumber, fuel, and those kind of things. But we have a few ways that we harvest trees. And like I said before, some are more environmentally sound than others. This first process we're going to write down in our notes is called clear cutting. Clear cutting is where basically you go into the forest and you cut the entire forest down. You cut everything down. It doesn't matter if it's a twig, it doesn't matter if it's a tree, whatever. You just go through with machines and you just cut. Everything must go. if you can imagine, this is the most environmentally destructive because it removes the entire habitat, and it is just going through and changing the entire climate of that area. So it takes a very long time for all of those trees to regrow in that area, if it can even establish itself through secondary ecological succession. So the negative about this is bad environmental impacts, increase of soil erosion by a large margin, and reduction of the nutrients in the area. Now the positive of this is the fact that it's very, very cost effective to do it this way. Logging companies can come through. They don't have to worry about what they're cutting and what they're not cutting. They can just start at the edge of the forest, cut the whole thing down, and go through. Now the second thing on our list here, second type of logging, is called selective cutting. This is where logging companies will go through and they'll mark certain trees for destruction or logging, where they're going to pick and choose trees. A hard thing about this is a lot of times, especially in tropical rainforests, the trees will have vines that go from one tree to the next, to the next, to the next. So if you cut one tree down, you got to make sure all the other vines are cut for it. Otherwise, it will take down trees near it. It's a very dangerous situation. So this is the most environmentally friendly way to do logging. And as you can imagine, it is also the most costly way to do logging, because you can't just build roads and take out a section. You've got to literally go in with probably axes and chainsaws and cut down individual trees, as opposed to just clearing the whole area. So the compromise between those two is strip cutting. So strip cutting is where the logging company comes in and they take apart one part of the area and they leave other parts intact, and then wait for years and years and years, and then go to another section near that area and then wait years. They kind of do this rotational cutting. So strip cutting, like here shown in this diagram, is where they cut down everything. So it's kind of like clear cutting, but they're only choosing small sections of the forest. Now it still does a little bit of forest fragmentation, but they're keeping larger parts of the forest intact and more of cutting small, you could say island-sized pieces, tiny island-sized pieces of the forest. This is kind of a win-win situation for both the environment and for logging companies, because it helps them make a good profit, but also gives the forest area time to bounce back. Now here, they never ever do strip cutting or cutting like this near streams. So what they want to try to do is avoid that, because there is an increase of this soil erosion here. And here, if we did it right next to the stream, we would have a lot of sediment pollution going directly into the streams. Now remember that sediment pollution inside of the stream causes a high amount of turbidity. Remember that word is the cloudiness. Turbidity is the cloudiness of the water. Turbidity decreases the fish's ability to swim around and see far distances. It puts sediment in the gills. It makes it hard for them to extract oxygen from the water. It also highly reduces photosynthesis because it's more cloudy, less light's getting to lower depths. And then because of that, it's reducing the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water accessible by organisms. So harmful effects of harvesting forests are, like I said before, increased erosion. We've got sediment runoff and then sediment pollution in the waterways, fragmentation of habitats from logging. We talked about fragmentation of that habitat reduces biodiversity. And then a lot of people complain that there's possible exposure of these environments to invasive species due to the logging equipment that comes in. The big vehicles they bring in could have seeds from other places where they have been and could deposit invasive species or plant invasive species in these regions. And then off-road vehicles is always an issue in pretty much every environment. So a way we can fix this is to reduce our need for trees, here is a stack of like junk mail. I know I get tons of junk mail. Reducing your need for paper, reducing our needs for wood products. Here is one of my favorites: excessive packaging, refusing to buy products that have excessive packaging. Here, this is something that got shipped here with this tiny device. It looks like a battery or something like that, and it's shipped in this gigantic box. So taking up a lot more space than it needs to, a lot more paper goods, and killing more trees just to ship one tiny little thing. Another thing is to find replacement plants for that. Knaf is here, and also hemp. Yes, it looks like marijuana because hemp is a variety of the marijuana plant. It's also a variety that doesn't have THC, which is actually the chemical that makes you high. But on the books in a lot of the states in the United States, hemp products are not allowed because they are tied to that marijuana plant species, or it's not the same variety, but so but it's counted as that marijuana plant, that illegal drug, so it's not allowed in any or most states in the United States. But these would be great replacement plants, as well as what was that invasive species we had? The vine that ate the South. I forgot the name of it right now. Some of you are probably thinking of it right now out loud, but that one is a good replacement for paper as well. We have those 4 R's of the recycling arrows, right? First one is refuse. So a way is to refuse products with excess packaging, refuse paper plates and paper cups and all those things that are disposable, and use things that are reusable. And then the end result, the last thing we want to do is recycle these products. Now you're thinking, okay, why would we not want to recycle? That's not really what I mean. It's more of like, of the 4 R's, refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle is the last on purpose because it takes the most energy out of all the things, and if we use these products less, then we won't have as much to recycle, and that's a good thing. So there's some government programs that also are working to help sort of conserve forests. 2 programs are called Debt for Nature Swaps and Conservation Concessions. These 2 videos are going to talk about those topics, take a few notes about both. But before we do that, I want to talk about this symbol right here. I'm seeing this a lot lately. It was not very commonly seen. It's actually in the back of your textbooks. And basically this seal is a seal that companies can get on their products to say that their product is sustainable farming. The FSC actually stands for Forest Stewardship Council. But this seal ensures that, one, workers that are working for the companies that get this seal are being given good working conditions and good pay. It also says that there is being used, anything forest or any of these products that are being used here are being produced with sustainable practices. So it's not just using the forest, but it's also using the forest in a way that it can recover. All right, so whoops, go back. All right, so we're going to see these 2 videos about conservation concessions and debt for nature swaps.
A tree is felled in the forests of Indonesia, a country which loses an area the size of Switzerland each year to logging. Indonesia's massive deforestation rates makes it the world's 3rd largest emitter of carbon dioxide, behind the United States and China. Deforestation also affects the country's wildlife. These forests are home to some of the world's most endangered species, including endangered tigers, elephants, rhinos, and the orangutan. In a new deal, the United States has agreed to trade $30 million in debt repayment for increased conservation of their habitat. Jennifer Morris is the Senior Vice President for the Ecosystem Finance Division of Conservation International, the group which brokered the deal between the United States and Indonesia.
To basically, instead of repaying that debt,
to put that money that they would have repaid to the U.S. government into conservation. So this deal, which is incredibly historic, it's the largest ever debt, what's called a debt swap, for that's ever happened, and this one is specifically for the country of Indonesia.
The deal signed by the U.S. Treasury Department permits Indonesia to put the money into a trust to protect 13 areas of forest on the island of Sumatra. Walter Lohman of the Heritage Foundation says he is concerned about the money getting to the right place, but he sees a lot of positives.
It's just another way to give them assistance. You could ask the same question about why do we give the world $20 billion in assistance every year. And it's because it's a small investment to build a relationship. We're building a relationship with the Indonesians.
That is a point underscored in key meetings between American and Indonesian officials.
I look forward to continuing to work with the foreign minister and the Indonesian government on all of these issues, and I'm confident that our relationship will grow stronger and deeper in the future.
Conservation International says the deal is an innovative way of helping both the people and the species of Indonesia. The United States has signed similar, smaller agreements with countries such as the Philippines, Guatemala, and Peru.
It's one of the best mechanisms that we have for development assistance from developed countries where that money can be used in a different way. Instead of going directly back and instead of being completely forgiven, the government of Indonesia has made this a really important commitment to invest in the conservation for the local people as well as for these critical species and habitats.
President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who has just won his second term in this month's presidential elections, has made cracking down on illegal logging a priority. Priscilla Huff, VOA News, Washington.
Tentu sistem dan undang-undang yang kita miliki memberikan ruang bagi pihak
In a sheltered corner of the Amazon rainforest lies a place that has remained intact for thousands of years. Early explorers called this place the Lost World. And to the people that live here, it is the perfect world. This is Guyana, a pristine haven for people, plants, and animals. But in today's globalized economy, its natural treasures have a different value, attracting logging and mining companies who would exploit the land. While this struggle plays out in surrounding countries, the government of Guyana is using a new and innovative approach and has chosen the green option. With the support of local communities and conservation partners, this approach is giving a new value to the country's standing forests, and for the first time, their efforts are paying off. For Guyanese biologist Eustace Alexander, this is a personal mission.
Roger that, George. Roger that.
He is managing one of the most successful conservation projects in the country, the Conservation Concession.
The goal of the conservation concession is for biodiversity conservation. According to the concept of the project, CI is paying the government of Guyana to keep the trees standing rather than having them being logged.
Under the terms of the agreement, the government is being paid exactly what they would have gotten had the area been logged, but rather than cutting the forest for its wood, we're protecting it in its pristine state, a kind of conservation concession rather than a timber concession.
Dr. Richard Rice has been working on the 200,000-acre conservation concession for the past 5 years.
The fact that logging would not be permitted in this area allows us to avoid deforestation. And deforestation is an action that leads to the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
The clearing of forests around the world accounts for at least 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions released into the atmosphere, more than all the cars and trucks in the world. Intact forests have the unique ability to trap carbon dioxide and release clean air back into the atmosphere. Like giant utilities, forests like this one not only clean the air we breathe, they also help regulate global climate. Through this conservation concession, Guyana is looking into the future. A future where a protected environment sustains a healthy population of plant and animal species found nowhere else on Earth. Surrounding communities are enjoying additional benefits such as employment and training as park rangers, and the construction of a community-operated eco-lodge.
The conservation concession has been an enormous success with the government and people of Guyana because for the first time they haven't had to choose between conservation on the one hand and economic development on the other, which is simply a practical necessity.
Guyana's conservation concession is a perfect model. It demonstrates that conservation and economic development can work hand in hand. Other countries can replicate this strategy and benefit, adding a valuable contribution to regulating our planet's global climate. And for Guyana, we can ensure that this pristine forest will continue to thrive in perpetuity.
With companies overusing the land is that they can do it because it's very, very profitable. And part of the reason why it's profitable because we have these things called subsidies. I don't know if you've heard of them before, but it's basically some of our taxes that go into the government are paid back to companies. Fossil fuels companies that operate in the United States get large subsidies, money that is given to them to offset the cost of operation. It's sort of like encouraging the company to come do business in our country. Now, part of that problem with fossil fuel industry is basically costing us a lot of money for the environment. It's costing us a lot of money in health concerns and health problems that are people having because of the pollution it puts into the air. Talking about logging companies also get government subsidies. So a lot of the way that they work is sometimes the governments will say, okay, if you build the roads in certain areas, then we will actually just let you have all the lumber for free. And so a lot of the companies actually don't pay for the forest that they're cutting down. They just pay to build roads here and there, and then the government uses those roads. But the government also does have government subsidies that help subsidize the costs of logging to help keep prices down in lumber. It helps companies stay in business, and it helps them be able to hire more employees so more people have jobs and that those people are paying taxes into the government. But the problem is we're having trouble sustaining the forests. So one of those things that we could do to help the forest be more sustainable is to cancel those government subsidies. All right, so natural threats. We also have natural threats to forest ecosystems, not just ones caused by people. One of those is fires. However, 90% of the wildfires that we have typically in a given year are caused by people. People who go out and leave their campfire not quite fully burned out and it's still hot, and then a spark flies and the wind picks up and it starts dry grasses on fire. And it also can be from shooting. A lot of people aren't aware that when you're firing a gun outside, that you can actually start a forest fire from just target practice, shooting outside, and it hits a spark, it hits a rock, and it starts things on fire. 10% of the fires are actually caused by lightning and lava. Now, this footage is from one of the California fires. Not that California is totally always on fire, but you can look at how terrifying this is as people are trying to flee and get out of this area for their mandatory evacuation and just kind of survive it. But these fires can just, if they're really hot, they can burn down everything. So insects and disease and climate change also affect forests. So here in this photo, This actually is not a forest that's been burned down. You can see a lot of brown trees, a lot of dead trees. The brown trees are also dead trees. And then just a few green trees here from there. This is actually a beetle infestation. Now, beetles, the bark beetle will go and eat the inside of the bark, the little soft, sweet part of the bark. And the problem with that is how the tree gets food and water up and down the tree. It uses these things that are kind of like veins and arteries. They're called xylem and phloem, where nutrients and water are going up the plant and down the plant and helping that plant survive. Well, the bark beetle will eat around, and if the bark eats all the way around the tree, then it kind of cuts off that ability for that tree to, use that sort of like veins and arteries, bringing that food up and down, and it will kill the tree. Well, a little bit of bark beetles, no big deal. A lot of bark beetles tend to be a big deal. And the problem is, as climate is changing, what we have is we have more and more and more bark beetle infestation because the winters aren't as cold. And so we have more bark beetles the next season. And then we have more bark beetles spreading from tree to tree to tree because of the fact that there's just more of them from the previous season. So we can have these natural things affecting forests as well. Okay, I believe... Nope. That doesn't bring us to the next part. Alright, so... Sorry. Just jumping ahead real quick. Let's cover this real quick. You're like, real quick, we've been talking for probably 40 minutes. Sorry. Alright, so manage and sustaining grasslands. Grasslands, again, are predominantly... dominated by grasses. That's why we call it a grassland. Pastures is a word for basically grassland area that we have fenced off. So here you can kind of see the barbed wire in this area here. We see a lot of pastures, especially if you drive up towards Willard or up towards Idaho. You see a lot of pastures there. So that's kind of the definition of a pasture, something that's basically fenced off. But a rangeland, make sure you write down these definitions, know the difference between the two. But a rangeland is kind of like a pasture without fences. It's going to be the natural environment. Rangelands are areas where everyone can use, so any rancher comes around with his cows can bring his cattle there. But it's natural land, or BML land. It's a Bureau of Land Management owned, where natural organisms are also going to be using this area. So we'll have deer, we'll have elk coming in this area, also eating in this area. So the commons, write the definition of a commons down, but it's the cultural or natural resources accessible to all members of a society, and that's including natural materials such as air, water, and habitable earth. So when we have the commons, we're talking about something that's used by everything. So when I just briefly mentioned rangelands, they're used by any kind of rancher and the natural environment. They would be an example of the commons. Another example of the commons would be the oceans, especially international waters, where pretty much anyone can be fishing in international waters. And then next time I'm here, we'll actually do the Tragedy of the Commons activity. It's kind of a wild one, so I don't want to have the sub try to manage that. So overgrazing happens with rangelands. We tend to overuse them, if you could imagine that. A lot of times it's the mentality of, well, everybody's using it, so it's not my responsibility. And so everybody just overuses an area. But overgrazing is when too many animals are going to be grazing too long in a certain area that can damage the grasses and the roots, which exceeds the carrying capacity of a rangeland area. Now, a rancher can just move his cows to somewhere else, or he can bring in feed and feed his cattle. But natural organisms that are coming through, like elk and deer and buffalo on rare occasion, they can't just deal with the food gone in that area. And a lot of times it's not just overgrazing or overeating the grasses, but if you're in an area, you can trample the grasses, you can pack the soil, so it's harder for oxygen in there, it's harder for water to seep in through the soils, and so we can create a harder area of plants to be able to regrow. When the plants are dead, again, we also have that increase in erosion by water and wind. And it also encourages invasives to be able to grow in the area. And a lot of times they're invasive species that the cattle won't eat. So the cows eat the grass down, and then the invasives spread more because there's more space, there's more sunlight, there's more access to resources. We're not going to look at that. So some solutions to overgrazing is this process called rotational grazing, where ranchers will say, okay, we're only going to be here for a certain amount of time, and then they move them to another section of the rangeland, and then they leave that rangeland, and they make sure that they leave areas for long periods of time, enough for the environment to recover before they come back to that same area, restricting the amount of time that the cattle are there. This one's not really highly popular. It's sort of useful, but it also damages a lot of things in the natural environment and puts toxins in the natural environments. But you could use herbicides to kill undesirable plants. Use control birds because those grasses do regrow after a burn, but some of those invasive species might not grow back. And then you could prevent overuse by enforcing this thing called PREA, which is that thing, I think, back here that I told you we were going to skip. Public Lands, Rangelands Improvement Act. But we'll talk about acts and stuff later. We're not going to talk about them now. We can also prevent urban development on rangelands by paying ranchers for conservation. So a lot of times ranchers will own acres and acres and acres of land. Well, they'll get to a point where they're too old to keep on ranching, and then they want to sell off their property to nearby areas because it's very profitable to be able to sell off that and have industry come in, or to have the entire subdivision maybe built into that rangeland. But if we pay pay some people to keep that as rangelands, their property, then it helps keep those natural environments available for future generations. Okay. I think, I'm going to skip ahead real quick. I think that is all that we need to cover today. Yay, yay, yay. And then yes, that's aquatics. We'll do aquatic biomes or aquatic life zones next time. So make sure you study all the material that we've covered for Chapter 7 and Chapter 9. We're having a test on that next time. Today you're going to be completing Chapter 9 questions. And that'll be everything for today.